space. Yet even as this sturdy lineage connects us, each generation of maker must ask again the most primordial of questions. What are these materials we have? How might they become something else? How might they help us to feel and understand? How might they tell us of ourselves as we communicate to each other? Questions like these are psychedelic in nature. They haunt us. They are a reminder that the practice of sculpture is not only meaningful to itself, but an essential medium with a continuum of being and being together on earth. I thought that was really beautiful. And as we go through Michael's work today, you're going to really see how this resonates with the continuing conversation that we are having on this platform. So Michael lives and works in France. He's a sculptor that explores natural objects in relation to folklore, technology, anthropology, geography, and magic. He has a methodical and prolonged working process that often spans decades, and he creates spaces where process and product, replica and real, natural and synthetic, and human and non-human intermingle with an uncanny household of earthly forms and desires. He uses materials such as meteorites, of-the-moment technology, ancient atmospheres, psychotropic medicines, prismatic rainbows, and the earth itself. I first met Michael in person when he was at the Bemis making magic himself, making rainbows. And I'm sure he's going to tell you about that. And while you'll see it on screen, the experience of being in that space and time at that moment was truly magical. His work's been exhibited extensively, nationally and internationally. He's a recipient of numerous awards, including Guggenheim Fellowship, Nancy Graves Foundation Award, Virginia A. Group Foundation Award, and Art Adia Award. He's also been awarded fellowships and residencies at the core program of the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, the MacDowell Colony, International Studio and Curatorial Program in New York City, Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts, and the Sharp Walentis Studio Program in New York. He's also a contributing editor of art papers, and of course, the associate professor at Virginia Commonwealth University in Sculpture and Extended Media Department. So with that, I will hand you over to Michael, and Gina will be our moderator throughout the rest of the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. That's really a nice introduction. And I'm going to try to share my screen like we do, and we'll get started. All right, so this is, I'm super happy to be here, and I'm really, of course, honored to be given the keynote, and also to just have this time to focus on some ideas around sculpture making that that I think live in the background for me, and I don't always get to bring them out and into the light and talk about them with some purpose. So it's a really nice chance to do that today. And I thought I was going to start with maybe just a self-identification. And you know, I think we all of us, we self-identify in certain ways, and perhaps it has to do with, you know, with our profession, what we believe it to be. And I think as artists, we can drill down, and it can be more specific. And how we do that, I think, it says something about our goals and desires and our dreams. And there's an anachronistic term called sculptor. And it's one that doesn't get used as frequently, and it's one that in some ways we've adopted artist as a, even folks that are working three-dimensionally or conceptually or in expanded fields, we use the term artist as a catch-all. And we don't dream about sculptor. And I feel like for me, like I think of myself as a sculptor. And I wanted to start by that, even though we might see things that maybe don't traditionally fall under the rubric of sculpture per se, but I think of myself in all the anachronisms as a sculptor. So this idea that Joanna started with of this small band of people that are roaming the planet, the sort of decentralized group of folks that are working with material, working with matter, and in a speculative way, not in a way that's always utilitarian. It's an ancient group, and I wanted to start with something about contact, and in some very challenging way, we could also say maybe about love. So there's this shell that I wanted to start with, and it's a tiny object in the world, and it lives on the world right now. It's about 1/2 inch, and we'll start here. But the story really takes place in this valley. And so if we go back about 20 years or so, we're on the Iberian Peninsula, and a group of researchers in Portugal were studying in this area called the Lepeta Valley. And the Lepeta Valley, of course, was probably called something different many times over, because it's a place that humans went to for thousands and thousands of years. It's about 16 or so miles from the Atlantic Ocean. There's no ocean to see here. There's a bone that was discovered. Archaeologists had been here before looking for things because they knew that early humans had been here, and they had continued to come here. And the bone was remarkable, and it was figured out to be a bone of a small child, so maybe 4 or 5 years old. And they started digging, and they discovered nearly a full skeleton, intact, except some small details. And they also discovered that this was a child that had been buried, very ceremoniously so, that there were details that lived amongst the bones that told another story, a deeper story about a child that had died, and that people that had buried this child in a very careful way. So there was a number of markers, but one of them was this small shell that was found near the child's head. And on closer inspection, the shell has a hole, and the hole, if you can analyze it, and you can see that the hole is intentionally made. And there's a kind of full belief that this shell was part of a pendant, and the pendant was probably placed around the child's forehead when it was buried. And I wanted to start here because this is a site that I think about, and I'll perhaps return to in the talk, but it also binds us in time. And in this way, when we think about love, we think about grief, we think about people through time, we think about materials, we think about objects of importance. And all of us at some point probably had been to the sea, and we saw a shell, and we decided that this shell of all shells we would save, that we would keep it. And this small little humble moment with this child resonates. So I want to show some work, but before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about thinking sculpturally. And this is really, I don't normally do this in a talk, but thinking sculpturally is a kind of, is a path towards understanding material and connection. And so if you look around in your space probably right now, you can look behind me, I'm in the studio right now. There's just, it's a bunch of materials. It's a bunch of objects. It's an amalgam of things. And that the world is that. The world is material. And of course, we're part of it, made from it. And it's interesting to think of all of the different professions that we have that in some way deal with matter, that deal with a very specific subset of material. So like if you are, let's say for instance, looking at super large objects in outer space and thinking of their movement, you might be like an astronomer. If you are dealing with very, very small objects like atoms, or the way that atoms form molecules or long chain molecules, you might be something like a chemist. If you work on cars, you're a mechanic. If you work with trees, you might be a forester. If you work, there's biologists and geologists, and all of them are some form of working with material, working with matter. And then there's sculptors. And what do sculptors do? And this is also couched in a day called University Day, and I'm excited by that. And I'm invested in a pedagogical practice over a long time, teaching sculpture. And so sculpture has been this zone within higher ed that just collects all these rogue activities, all these things that don't quite fit in, but sculpture will accept it. So in my own department, we decided years back to call it sculpture and extended media. So extended media being a kind of moniker that held all this stuff that maybe didn't classically fit within sculpture proper. So the other thing that we should talk about, and really briefly, we can have a whole lecture on this, is transmutation and transformation. And so we're invested in, we're all transmuting, we're all transforming, we're all becoming something else. And the objects in our space, they might seem static, but on a long enough timeline, they're slowly becoming something else. They're slowly changing into something else, as we are. And sculpture becomes a kind of, not just a metaphor to understand that, but actually a platform to experiment with it, to try to understand what it means to be a person right now amongst these materials. What are these materials? But also to imagine how they transform. And the last thing is this idea of meaning. Meaning itself becomes a plastic thing that sculptors get to play with. So we'll talk more about it. I hope. I don't have that much time, but we'll dive in. So some talismans. So talismans are they're an interesting subset of objects, because there's a belief that they hold extra dimensional property. So not just a volume on the planet, not just a kind of physical thing, but there's something magical about them, that they hold a different set of powers. And if we think of art objects in the most aspirational sense, they're talismanic, they're magic. And it's important to try to remember that, but it's also important, I think, and I have to remind myself of this in the studio, to strive towards that. And there's a way that objects in how we produce them now can exist just as a skin. as a surface. And that surface is interesting, but the totality of the object and the ways in which it reports to us and it shows us its magic doesn't always live on the surface. It lives in another field. The other thing, I mean, there's many things, but there's a thing about when we're dealing with sculpture, it's there's a trick to it. And I'm going to try to tell you a few that I think I'm starting to understand. One is that we only have the materials we have. That even as we try to produce something that could lift out of its own sort of dumb materiality, its own sort of baseness, it's just base. It's just material. So it's we live in the world of the real, and that's that can't change. It's we are in this world of the real. But the thing that's also interesting with it is, as we only have these sort of humble materials, these sort of earthbound materials, like not a new material won't just emerge where suddenly it levitates for us, like it's stuck to the ground. We deal not just with the real, but with the possible. And this is, I think, an interesting thing to linger on, where even as we only have what we have, clay or this, wood or steel or plaster or plastic, even sophisticated polymers or titaniums, we have to deal with the possible, and the possible is a whole field of things that haven't become yet, that haven't arrived yet. And so it's this middle ground of tension between these sort of humble materials, these sort of silly materials, and the possibilities of them where we live as makers. There's another function, and I hope to maybe touch on it in a few different ways. And the function is how we, through a process of being closer to materials and objects, things of the world, including ourselves and others, how do we practice and exercise a new form of empathy? And empathy is a word that kind of traffics around a lot these days, but it feels in some ways that sculptors have a built-in practice where they've already figured out ways of being with things and communing with things, building more sophisticated relationships with things. So they're not just resources, they're not just materials, they're animated, they're enlivened somehow. And I think this is an important function. And so when we think of this group of professions, that are working very specifically in one way or another about some subset of matter, what's the function of being a sculptor? Is there some out of time use value right now? And that might be one of them. I think there are many, that there's a sensitivity that we have to the material world that doesn't just see things as sort of lifeless. They become enlivened. So I have all these bubbles in my on my screen, but I want to say this is always such a weird. It's a weird environment to do this, because I feel like I'm really bad at giving Zoom lectures. I feel like doing a lecture in person, it's like there's such an exchange, and it's such a weird environment to give this. That said, I just noticed that we have a chat option, and I would actually love it if I can't. I'm not going to try to flip through the chat, but I would love it if anybody has a question or wants to stop. If someone in the core group could just let me know. And I'm happy to, it's actually really helpful because I'll go down a weird path. So questions now and then are really helpful.
I can throw one at you from
go for it.
What you were talking about. So Nicole is asking if you had anything that you'd consider a personal talisman.
Oh God. I mean, there's so many. I mean, I'm in the studio, so I can start pulling them out, you know. It's I mean, it's like I'm surrounded by a whole bunch. I mean, it's like, I mean, here I'm just grabbing the first one I see, you know. It's like, Nicole. Like here's a wild style one. I mean, this is this meteorite that Joanna mentioned. So there's a few that circulate in artworks, and this one has lived in the studio for a while, and it's this, I mean, it's a crazed object that's older than the earth itself. And so you hold it in your hand and you feel it challenges everything about you as a being, because you project out into the world and you can't understand this thing. It's the world 4.5 billion years old, this meteorite close to 5 billion, you know, thinking of it traveling through space, and like against all odds, you think Earth sort of moving at this very specific rate, a tiny body in a mass void, and this meteorite also moving for billions of years, and they make contact with each other, and then this crazy moment of contact, and then all of these things trickle down from it. So this specific meteor has all these powers. That's one talisman. There's a lot more, but yeah, that can get pretty trippy in the studio, you know, with different kinds of objects that float around. So another thing, as I'm just kind of showing these are all some sculptures that I've made as a backdrop to this conversation. So I'm going to talk specifically about a few projects and sculptures that I've made and go deeper into them. But right now, these talismanic sculptures, I'm just going to use as a backdrop. So I've also been thinking about this idea of contact, right? So this moment where Earth, the meteorite touch, for instance, there's a way of understanding the material world actually as really erotic, and erotic in the sense that things want to touch, that things and this is a theory, that things actually desire to come in contact with other things. And this is why matter exists. So if you think of an atom and you think of what happens when an atom joins another atom, there's a valence. So it's like, if we all learn this in chemistry, like this idea of like the electron shell, and like what atoms could touch other atoms and form a molecule, and how that happens. So if you think of that concept in a very liberal sense, just expanded, matter is moving around, desiring to come in contact with other matter. So these kind of valent attractions are important, and we have them, and sometimes they're surprising because we have fields of objects that form compositions that are somehow held in this valent attraction, where things coming in closer and closer proximity to other things. So this is thinking sculpturally. This is a way of charging a dead world, like a world of inert things, into an enlivened world of charged and desirous and erotic things. So these, you know, some of these sculptures are pretty weird. So this one, for instance, I'll just talk about really quickly, just to add some additional context. So it's a group of objects in a vitrine, but there's another invisible thing that I'm vested in, and so in this particular object, for instance, inside the vitrine is an atmosphere. So it's an atmosphere that's simulating what it was like on Earth about 450 million years ago. So the moment of the Cambrian explosion. So that moment is the moment that we believe we can trace back all of our living ancestors to this single organism. So this sort of trace becomes an important thing, but it also becomes an impossible thing to understand atmospherically. So inside the vitrine is this atmosphere that's modeled, actively modeled. So you can't see it. You can't see this atmosphere. It just looks like an empty vitrine. But the systems are there that help you understand what's there. So it builds a belief, a field of belief around it. And so many of the objects that that might feel special to us, it's not that the object in and of itself is somehow doing it. So thank you, Nicole, for this. So this is not, I mean, this is just a piece of iron, right? It's like a 47-pound piece of iron. If we got really detailed, there's about 5% nickel and some trace elements. But the object itself isn't that special. It's a belief field that wraps around it. So many of the objects have this other element that's not optic, that lives in the shadows. This one, for instance, has is embedded with silver. So there's a hunk of silver that lives inside this blanket sculpture. Or this one, for instance, is a cryogenic freezer. So it's a group of pots that live atop this cryogenic freezer. So inside the freezer are nine small boulders, like stones, rocks, gathered from around the world, that are frozen to 1 degree colder than the coldest possible the coldest possible recording on Earth. So you can feel the cold, and you have just a kind of black pedestal in the form of a cryogenic freezer, but there's this other thing that's happening that's not optical. So I've invested in this quite a bit. This one has I mean, just illustratively, like this one is just a wall-based sculpture, but there's a number of medicines that are baked into the cast of this hand. So in the black section on the right-hand side, there's a sculpture of a hand that's broke, an arm that's broken. And so inside this object, there's medicines and psychotropics. We're going to keep going. This is such a short session. The invisible, or how deep to sculpt. So this is a good transition to this idea of the invisible. So much about our sculptures could live as a skin, but there's this whole other dimension of the inside, how deep to sculpt. So this is an image sort of this glacier that some of y'all probably have heard about, that people call it like the apocalypse glacier, the doomsday glacier, the Thwaites glacier. It's this massive object in Antarctica, this huge object. So Timothy Morton would call this a hyper object. So this is an object, though, that's invisible to us. Even though it's massive, very few people can see it. And even if you were there, it's impossible to see as a thing because it's so big. So invisibility works in all of these other ways. This is not an image this is not a work of mine. This is a former colleague of mine, Elizabeth King, who's a kind of important person, I think, for many, many people, me included. She taught at BCU for about 30 years. And I was lucky enough to be there for about 10 of them, and overlapped and learned a lot from her. And there's a book that she wrote about called A Sculptor's Reverie. And there's a chapter in it about an ear. So this is an ear that she sculpted. It's in porcelain. And just really quickly, I think it's beautiful. The reverie here is about how deep to sculpt, and she was talking of the ear canal, and you can see how detailed this ear is. And it presents a question to the sculptor of like, how deep do I sculpt into the canal? Do I go deep enough for when you see, and that's it? Or do I go deeper beyond your ability to see? And does my belief in the object transcend something silly or something like optics? And this question, I think, is really beautiful. And it talks about our own belief in our work and how it goes and lives in the world. This sculpting deeper into the canal than what can be seen. I wanted to show just a number. This is one project called Rivers that I did. And I didn't think of this at the time when I made it, but so many of the actions existed in the realm of invisibility that they were incredibly hard to do, but they ended up being invisible. So this is, I'm going to go through this quickly. This is a boulder on the banks of the Allegheny. There's a hole that's drilled through the boulder, and there's a human bone that's inserted in the boulder and sealed up. And someone just sent me a picture of this the other day, and the boulder is doing well. It's still there on the banks. So there was the form of this project, just to give you a little bit more sense of it, is 9 actions that take place over 9 days. So 9 revolutions around the earth. Each day, 1 action that all interrelate and create a sort of domino, and that all have something obliquely to do with the river system in Pittsburgh, which is intense. This is the Allegheny Observatory. There's incredibly important refractor, a telescope there. So in this one, it's a human hand that's just touching the telescope. The next day, these 2 were lovers. One lover was touching the telescope, and the other lover was touching this electron microscope. So this was across town, and she touched the microscope as we were looking at river silt. This one was a bonfire. And so for years and years, about 2 years leading up to the project, I collected driftwood from around the world that had been collected off of riverbanks. And so hundreds and hundreds of pieces over time. And this might sound really crazy, but we had this bonfire where we used the driftwood to ignite. And at the end, it was ash and just the particles that were released into the atmosphere. Feel free, I see some chats. I don't know what they say, but if someone wants to just interrupt me, that's cool.
I can go ahead and give you, we have a couple coming in, but from Mia, she was asking, how do we sculptors relate to synthetic materials? Are they the embodiment of trauma? How can plastic be holy?
Oh God, yeah. Oh my God, that's such a great one. I mean, it's, oh God, yeah. There's a few, I have a few, oh my God. In some ways, I feel like I want to hold that question because it might relate to something else. But I mean, there's on one level, if we're not creating a system where we're applying human anthropogenic values, we can just see it's like a plastic is like as a kind of petrocarbon or petrochemical. It's this kind of long chain molecule, you know, and it does this thing. When we think of it in relation to our bodies, we have to consider it with a different set of values, a different set of ethics. And it's complicated. It's extremely complicated because we, as we live on the planet, we live with others, and our works in some small way become a proxy to our values. And so all of us are trying to work on that, I would imagine. And it doesn't happen overnight, you know, so, oh my God, I feel like I want to talk about this a lot, but I feel like I don't have the time within the frame, but I'm gonna memory hold that because I'm gonna come back to it. This is a really interesting question though. Real quick, this is a book that I gifted, this old antique book that I gifted the Carnegie Library, the branch that overlooks the Three River Junction, that describes in very, very granular detail navigating the river system in 1818. And this is a kind of a material transformation. This is a piece of lead that was recovered from a sunken sailing vessel that was melted down into a handrail on a boat that still lives on the banks. It was tied to a sycamore tree in the 90s that just is there. And so there's a handrail you can see in the center of the frame that was removed. The mold was made out of it, and it was cast from this lead that was dredged from the bottom of the Atlantic. And then the last gesture in this, just to talk about invisibility and the way that these gestures that are complex and logistically complex in some ways are invisible. This was a text message that was sent by a satellite. So this is from a satellite. You can text not just the beacons, land-based beacons, but you can text up to a satellite. So this was a satellite that pinged, or a text message that pinged the satellite and then pinged back down to this device. All right, a few more things. Scale. So scale is this other thing that we deal with, and scales, it's trippy. It's so most of the time the scale is in relation to our body. So the scale, this is the measurement device, is our body, and because of that, the kinds of objects that we tend to think about and work on live at the scale of our bodies. The table, the room, maybe even a building, but they're all anthropogenic in some sense. So I started to devise, I started to think about a way that we might think of scale differently or challenge scale. And the earth became another unit to imagine scale operating at. And so I started a project called 12 Earths a number of years back. And 12 Earths is, the form is kind of simple, and it has to do with the sphere of the earth. So earth being a kind of round thing. So there's a circumference, and we have them, you know, the equator, for instance. So, but there are millions and millions of other circumferences, and each one of those lines around the planet connects places. And so I started to imagine a line amongst all of these lines, this ring, this path around the earth that connected 12 locations that together could tell us something about ourselves in relation to the planet. And so that project is has been going on. It's super interesting work, but it challenges everything I know about sculpture in some ways. And I've been working really intensely with a number of the sites over the last 4 years. And just about, even though I know the sites, my studio is going to release the first site on the summer solstice. So these are a few teasers. And so this project opens up a number of questions, also about, well, let's see, immensity. So, and this is a trick in a way. So Bachelard, who wrote a lot about poetics and space, had this idea that there was a term he coined called intimate immensity. And that immensity actually in relation to the body is not something that's fixed to size. That when you can feel something immense, that's small, that's tiny. But the feeling of immensity in the body, the chemicals that are released are enormous. And so in some ways, when we think about the earth and we think about, say, something as small as some fragment on your table, there really is no difference. The feeling that can come from each is unfixed to their size. It lives inside of us. And there's scale is a funny thing, because when we could think of things as still even. So when we go illustratively, when we go to a statue or something, we think of it as still. We're only actually understanding it in the scale of our body, because scale operates as a temporal thing, as a time-based thing. That when we see the stillness, we register it as still because we live in 100-year bodies, if we're lucky, little 100-year vessels. But it's moving fast. The stone is moving fast. It's crumbling before our eyes, if we were another entity. Which leads us to time. So time is also an important part of all this, I think. And Joanna started off with this sculpture that she saw, which is actually pretty amazing, because not many people saw this work. It was in Nebraska at this place called the Bemis Center for Contemporary Art. And it came from a number of problems. And one was technical, of like how to make a public artwork. Some of us are dealing with that problem in different ways. Like, how do I show my work in the public? How does it translate from the studio to the gallery, from the museum into the world? And so I was wrestling with that for years. And the other was like, well, what about time? What about time? And I started to imagine a subset of objects that were in a sense time travelers, that weren't fixed to time in the way that the statue was, that's moving through time, even though we can't see it, or the way that a mountain is, or the way that inversely like a banana is. Like you can also almost see a banana ripen in front of your eyes. But like a rainbow as a kind of speculative object that's time traveling. So the same family that buried their child in what's now Portugal 25,000 years ago, you could imagine them seeing a rainbow on the vista. They saw the same thing. They're our cousins. You could imagine inversely someone 25,000 years from now, hopefully if we're here, somebody will be here, and them seeing a rainbow. So it's this idea that it's moving through time and it's not degrading. It's a kind of resilient object. And so trying to figure out a way to dock or vend these two ideas of a public artwork and this poem, the sculptural poem about time. So one of the problems with this, and this is a kind of ethic that it lives in a lot of the works, is like, well, how to do it? Because there's a way you just like turn on the city water and like let the rainbow roll. So to add some complexity to this, we set up a kind of condition early on that all the water had to be captured, that it had to they had to come on top. So the water that fell on the roof was collected in these tanks, filtered, and then was used for the rainbow. And then that happened in a perpetual loop. There was a number of objects, and Johanna, again, she mentioned this, that were in the gallery that opened up this other speculative idea about time. One was this object called a Bristol cone pine, which is, I'm sure folks in this room would know, is an object. It's the oldest living thing on the planet. So they can be, 4,000 years old. This was watered on a drip from the rainbow. So a small bit of that water was siphoned off and watered this tree. There was a number of other objects on a table that were nearby, kind of enigmatic in some ways. This quilt from the 1800s from Pennsylvania. This shell where I was born in Micronesia. This meteorite, this is another meteorite. This one's quite a bit bigger, that landed in Argentina, what's now Argentina, 5,000 years ago. This one is also older than the Earth itself. So you have these objects, the rainbow, the tree, this shell that's caught in some kind of slow-mo evolutionary loop, this quilt that time signature just really clings on to, and this meteorite that's somehow older than everything around it, this sort of time outlier, creates this poem. All right, we're at the end. Forecasting known unknowns. What are we doing out here as sculptors? So there's this being couched inside of University Day. There's a question, like, well, what are we doing? And I might open it up and just pose it, and hopefully we can. I have some ideas about it, but perhaps it's the right time to shift gears and turn it into a conversation, which I'm most excited by, if there's time. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Did I adhere to the time limit?
You did. We have about 5 minutes left in the session, and there are some questions. We have 2 questions, so maybe we'll be able to get to both of them. Laura is asking, it is interesting to see how artists and communities create work using their surrounding resources. How does the history and cultural uses of the materials you use impact your work? And do you expand on the material's history or use that as something to build from?
Whoa, that's a great question. Let me see if I understand it. Can you just read it really quickly one more time? I feel like I missed some texture.
Sure. So it is interesting to see how artists and communities create work using their surrounding resources. How does the history and culture uses of the materials you use impact your work? Yeah. And then do you expand on the material's history or use that as something to build from?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it makes me think of a few different things. One is, this question that Joanna posed when she was opening the discussion was like, what are these materials? what are these materials? So if you think of each generation of maker asking that question to themselves, like, what are these materials? For us, like in that lineage, and it will change, it will continue to change. But for us, these materials is strange because of how the way that the earth has flattened in some ways. I don't like that term, but the way that it's compressed itself. So there's, if we think of the material world, we can at any moment slice off a piece of it, you know. So if I want speculatively, like if I want a mud cloth, which is this kind of wonderful blanket from Africa in what's now Nigeria. I can click on a few things right now, and probably in 60 seconds, I can have one on its way, you know. So, you know, if I want a special meteorite fragment, I can source from really reputable meteorite dealers, and I can have one delivered via FedEx before Friday. So this question of, if as sculptors, as because we're engaged in this, is do we do this? What are its implications? How do we do it sensitively and ethically? Or do we engage in a different way with the local? And what does that mean? So I think for me, those are very primary questions, especially working on a project that tries to understand something of the earth in relation to our bodies. So how the idea of local means, what the idea of how to combat embedded systems of oppression as it relates to colonialism. How do we not just keep reliving those horrors and traumas in our actions? So some of what you're asking actually, I think, deals with something specific and small. What do we do with our materials? Some of it's massive and big, like existentially big. It's a really beautiful question that I'm curious how you might answer too.